Today I'm going to give you a few tips in using Brava's TempSensor, but before I do so I want to explain why this piece of technology is so important. First and foremost, this is what tells the oven when to stop. It's how the oven knows when your food is done to perfection. It's also used as a measuring tool, and I'll show you guys a couple of close-ups in just a minute, but just know, because height is so important, that the TempSensor is also what you're going to use to measure the height of the protein. The first step in using the TempSensor is to use it as a measuring tool. And what you can see here are these different demarcations. This first line goes up to 1 inch, and then it goes in ½ inch increments afterwards. This is really simple on the oven user interface because there's a little slider that's going to ask you to slide it up to the corresponding height. So let me give you a really quick demo of how we do this. The first thing that you want to do is just set the TempSensor down on its point, right up near the highest point of the protein. The next thing that I think is really important is to actually physically get your head down to eye level to really see. Because if I try and read the height from standing up too tall, it's not going to give me the proper height. Your eye has a really easy way of misjudging that height. So to really truly find how tall it is, you need to get down. And this one I can tell is right here, which is exactly 1½ inches. So now we know. This steak is 1½ inches. Now, when I use the TempSensor, I actually like to insert it before I plug it into the oven. I find it's a little bit easier to do so. Before you do that, though, you want to make sure that you're orienting the TempSensor properly. You always want to make sure that the thickest side of the protein is on the left-hand side of the tray because that's where the TempSensor plugs in. The next thing I like to do is make sure that it's oriented properly. There's a front and a back side. The front side looks like this, where the cord is coming out to the right. The back side has these 2 screws and a little barcode right here. So whenever I'm using the TempSensor and inserting it, I want to make sure that it's oriented the same way that it's going to be plugged into the oven. So now that I have it on the top side, just like it would be plugging into the oven, I want to go down and I want to find the dead center from the bottom to the top, which is going to be right about here. And the next important thing is to insert the TempSensor all the way to the handle. This is really, really important, you guys, because if you don't, you run the risk of basically frying the TempSensor. The inside of the oven is a really harsh environment. We spend a lot of time developing the TempSensor, but if you leave it out like this, it's going to burn up. You need to insert it all the way. And notice also how I made that a perfectly horizontal. I've seen a lot of other mistakes where people are putting it at a weird angle, like that. That's not going to do very well. I've seen where people aren't putting it on the left side, but they're actually putting it up in the front at a strange angle. That's not going to do very well for you either. So make sure that you're always inserting it horizontally, right through the center, all the way to the handle, just like that. Now that we've gotten the TempSensor into the protein, let's go ahead and move over to the oven and I can show you how we insert it into the oven. Because this is a New York steak, I'm going to get up on the oven user interface here and I'm going to choose New York strip steak. I'm going to choose 1 steak and I'm going to want it cooked to medium rare. It gives me the cook guide saying season it with salt. For the purposes of this demo, I'm not going to season it. It tells me to put it in zone 2, which we've already done. Now it's asking me to plug it in. And because we oriented it properly, this should be really easy. We just plug it in just like a USB jack, and you should listen for that noise. That's going to tell you that it's plugged in. On that top screen, we remember that this steak was 1.5 inches thick. And remember that that 1.5 inches is going to come up to that little point. So all you do is just slide it up and it's going to say 1.54 inches is plenty close for me. It doesn't have to be exactly 1.50. That's close enough. And then it's going to give you a quick little guide. The next thing you do is make sure that it's on the proper shelf. And the last and arguably most important thing about using the TempSensor is to give it a last look. We want to make sure that the TempSensor is tucked beneath this shelf that's on the left-hand side. What that does is prevent it from going up into the lamps and burning up. What you don't want to see is something like this. That will burn up the TempSensor. So it's really simple. If you see that, just go ahead and give it a nice little tuck underneath the shelf. A couple of other things to keep in mind when using the TempSensor. A lot of people want to use a steak that is less than 1 inch, and you absolutely can do that, like we've talked about before, but you do need to go into either sear mode or Pro Cook Beta in order to cook a steak thinner than 1 inch. The reason is because the further, or the thinner the steak is, the further away it is from the lamp, and the longer it's going to take to achieve a sear. And what we found is that at right around 1 inch in the Brava preset mode, by the time that inch-thick steak gets a sear, it's usually overcooked. So the way to combat that is to cook those thinner steaks and thinner pork chops using sear mode with a flip. You don't want to try and cook anything less than 1 inch using the TempSensor because it's really, really difficult to properly insert it. The chance and likelihood that it will cause a misread is very, very high. So make sure that anytime you're using anything over 1 inch that you use the TempSensor, anytime you're using anything below 1 inch that you're going into either Pro Cook Beta or to sear. One final tip is that I talked a little bit about earlier is making sure that you insert that TempSensor perfectly horizontally. If you make too much of a mistake, what's going to happen is that it's going to go to the portion of the protein that's already cooking. You want it in the dead center because that's going to be the coldest part of the protein. When you don't put it directly in dead center, it's going to read that it's that it's cooking before it's actually fully cooked, and it's going to cause the oven to shut off before the protein is actually cooked. So again, make sure that you're finding the dead center of that meat from the top and the bottom, and that you're inserting it horizontally all the way to the handle. One other really cool function of the TempSensor is that it tells you how cold the meat is before you cook it. And in most cases, we ask that you take the meat straight from the refrigerator into Brava. A lot of people have been trained in the last few years to bring steaks and chicken breasts and things to room temperature before grilling or before cooking. We don't recommend that with Brava. You're going to have a better chance of achieving the perfect sear if you pull those proteins straight from the refrigerator. There are a couple of exceptions though. If you're doing a larger format piece of protein, like a big roast, like a prime rib or a pork loin roast or even a whole chicken, you actually will get a little bit of advantage by letting it temper out at room temperature for 30 to 45 minutes because it's going to actually speed up your cook a little bit. But for most things like steaks, chicken breasts, pork chops, and thinner cuts of meat, make sure that you pull them straight from the refrigerator and put them into Brava as quickly as possible. The temperature range that we support is anywhere between 32 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit starting temperature. And if you notice when you plug that TempSensor in that it says it's over 55 degrees Fahrenheit, we recommend that you go ahead and put that protein back in the refrigerator to cool off a little bit more. You can still cook it, it's still going to do it, but the chance that you will cook it faster and not achieve the perfect sear is a little bit higher if you don't follow that 32 to 55 degree Fahrenheit guideline.